Hi, I'm Simon. Some of you might already be familiar with my work. I've been growing bonsai trees for a little over 40 years now, I think, if I can't remember the exact day I started. And over that time I have never once in 40 years actually paid for a bonsai tree. Everything that you will see in future videos are trees that I've made myself over that time from what originally started in many cases as very, very simple material that anybody could lay their hands on. Today I'm going to show you how I prepare my weeping willow for winter display. So this is my weeping willow, which some of you might recognise. I started this over 40 years ago, and it's actually my oldest bonsai, because I started the cutting, which was as thick as a matchstick, a couple of years before I actually discovered bonsai. When I was looking around for some material to twist into bonsai trees, this was about the first thing I laid my hands on. So here we are in the workshop, and today what I need to do is obviously remove all this plasticine that's been on there all summer to actually weight the branches down to establish a bend in the branch, because on this scale even a weeping willow doesn't actually weep. So that needs to be removed. There's lots of dieback on here. This is perfectly natural for a weeping willow. It's their sort of life growth strategy, if you like. They grow very quickly and they make sort of insubstantial wood, which some of it will be shed in the winter, but they make a lot of growth in the summer. So I'm not worried about that. It's just a little inconvenient sometimes from a bonsai point of view, because it decides what dies, not me, which is just something you have to live with, I guess. The other thing I'll do, once the plasticine's off, there's still a little bit of spring in this, so these branches will spring up a little bit. I don't want that. I want these branches to hang vertically, and the image is so much better if you can do that. And in order to do that, I'm going to need to flex these branches a little bit. They'll take quite a bit of that, and it's almost impossible to actually snap a weeping willow branch at this point. So it's very forgiving in that respect. So the weights have been on the branches now since, well, back in the summer. The first ones were probably put on in May, and then the process continues right through the summer. So as soon as the branches reach a length of, I say branches, the new shoots I should say, if I'm being precise, as soon as they reach a length of say 6 to 8 inches, I will put the weight on. Now, if the branches are on the sort of periphery of the tree where they get lots of light, I'll pinch out the growing tip of that shoot when I put the weight on. But if the branches are hanging inside the tree where they get less light, I leave the growing tip on to allow it to keep on growing. And I'm moving the vigour, if you like, from the edges of the tree that are going to ripen much more easily towards the centre of the tree, so that these internal twigs are able to ripen, or so that they have a better chance of doing so. Sometimes the shoots will make another break of bud. You can see this one has. Now you can see that hasn't reached a sufficient length as far as I'm concerned to need another piece of plasticine, but if it did, then I'd simply put another piece of plasticine on and I'll keep going through the summer like that. A few of the branches, you'll notice, are sort of twisted at some quite unusual angles, and I do that quite deliberately just to sort of break the rhythm of the tree a little bit. I think of them like the flat notes on a piano. On their own they don't sound very good, but put in between the harmony of the other notes, they give you a bit of visual interest, I suppose. There's a particular shape I use for this. You'll notice they're rather like a sort of beehive shape, and I've put them on quite deliberately that way. what I found initially, I just put them on a flat spiral, and as the twigs ripened and swelled a little bit, they actually split the plasticine, and maybe 50% would fall off by the end of the summer. So I start with a long kind of worm coil of plasticine, pinch it at the top, and then I wrap it round, and it's kind of hollow underneath. So this bit is the bit that's holding the branch. This is the weight, but when the branch swells, it doesn't actually break, so it stays on. Okay, so that's all the plasticine removed. Probably several kilos sometimes. It really does make a difference to the weight of the tree. You can see that the branches of the tree, now that the plasticine's removed, has sprung back a little bit. It's more the shape of an umbrella really than a weeping tree. So I'll come back to that in a minute. The next job now is to remove all these bits of dieback that I mentioned earlier and unclutter the image so you can see what you've got to work with. So that's the next job. So some of these branches that have died back are quite big, and this is partly a lack of light, but you can actually tell quite early in the growing season which ones are going to ripen and become new wood and which ones it's going to shed. You can see this branch has only quite short shoots on it, and those shoots will have sort of terminated growth probably back in June, and they've put on very little growth since. If you really feed and water heavily, you might be able to wake a few of them up, but ultimately it's always going to shed some of these branches. So I just need to cut them off neatly. There's lots of little stubs at the base of those branches as well, and all of those want to be taken off. Every bit of dead wood is a distraction to the eye, and it detracts from the elegance and movement of the tree really. So we take off as many as we can. One of the nicest things about weeping willow in the winter when it's being displayed is this nice yellow, orange, even sort of rusty red colour of the shoots. So it makes it quite a colourful tree compared to a lot of winter image trees. So even though they're not fully ripened branches, they have a certain attractiveness. And you might notice that if you look at the overall form of the branches, you'll see this arc repeated over and over again, and that's previous years when these branches have been weighted down. So I'll have to remove this in the spring. In the spring these will all be pruned back to this kind of length. You can see the previous shoots. You know, maybe some will even be pointing upwards. But this is good until, let's say, mid-March, something like that. This is one of the first trees to start growing in the year. It will be making green growth by the end of February, quite possibly, depending on how mild the weather is. And by the end of March, the winter image is really gone. And then it will carry on growing then until probably into November. So there's quite a short winter for this tree. It's known to be one of the longest growing seasons of any temperate tree. It's not actually a wild tree. It's a naturally occurring hybrid between white willow, Salix alba, and another one, I can't remember. but I think possibly cracked willow, something like that. You might also notice that the first branch for a bonsai is pretty high, certainly more than halfway up, and you know, getting close to 2/3 of the way up the tree, I suppose. And obviously being a weeping tree, you need that height in order to best show off the weeping style as a bonsai, I guess. In its earlier incarnations, which you may have seen some pictures of, if not, they will be included. I actually displayed this tree on quite a high table, and many of the branches were weeping well below the edges of the pot and past the base of the table, and that was because the first branches at that time were quite low down on the tree, so there wasn't really room for them to weep. As a bonsai, willow's not easy material. Ramification is sparse, I guess. It's not like a Zelkova or a Japanese maple, but because the branches are weeping, each shoot, of which there are relatively few in bonsai terms, is actually doing quite a bit of visual work in the end. So it's okay. It's nice to have a weeping tree. It's not easy to do the weeping style as a bonsai. So although it's been a long project, it's been worth the perseverance, I suppose. And I've had a good response, I guess, when I've been able to show the tree. I did get a nomination at Noelanders in Belgium for this one. Didn't win, unfortunately. But then there was a tree by Mr. Kimura there that somebody had allegedly paid nearly €30,000 for, so I paid nothing for this one because it was the size of a matchstick when I started. So I reckon that's okay. I don't mind being beaten by Masahiko Kimura. I can live with that. One of the real pluses, I guess, is after 40 years the bark of this tree now is really beginning to age. One of the things that was mentioned at Noelanders was that the tree, although it was a beautiful image, shall we say, it didn't have the maturity, but now the bark's really aged quite well. They're pretty rot resistant, willows, I guess because they grow in wet environments. So you don't need to worry too much about disease or anything getting into the wounds, but I do tend to seal the larger cuts, but really just to speed up the healing. What they are a little bit prone to is something I think called silver leaf, certainly some kind of a mould that they get, and that is usually not a result of them being too damp, as it is with a lot of trees, but actually the result of them being a little bit on the dry side. They're very thirsty trees. In the wild, they like to grow with their toes in the water on the bank of a river, and will tolerate actually being in the water, which many trees won't. And you need to try and reproduce that if you're going to grow one as a bonsai tree. But when I first started growing this tree, I read the bonsai books that were available, and they all said that I should stand the tree in a water tray so that it was permanently, or it had permanent access to water. Its toes were in the water, like I was saying. So that's what I did. And I tried that for a couple of years, but what I found was when I came to repot the tree, there were virtually no roots in the pot. They'd all gone through the drainage hole at the bottom and round the water tray that I had it stood in. And so when I had to cut all of that off in order to get the tree out of the pot to repot it. And obviously that actually sapped a lot of vigour from the tree, having to completely replace the root system in order to get going again. Didn't kill it because they're tough as old boots, and I could cut that off 6 inches from the ground and probably stick it in a bit of damp soil and it would start to grow roots again. It probably wouldn't kill it, but ideally you want some roots in the pot. So the solution I came up with was to have a drip feed from a bucket, and I used to have a bucket stood on a post beside the tree with a couple of little drippers and a siphon, and that would just constantly drip water all day long in the tree. And I might have to top it up once or twice a day, and it just dripped very slowly and kept the tree waterlogged. And that worked a treat, and it grew like mad. And I did that for a few years, and then I realised it was actually growing too fast, and if I didn't slow it down I wasn't going to be able to lift it pretty soon. So now I just make sure that it gets watered twice a day at least during the growing season, and I just do my best to keep it as wet as I can. You know, this tree, more than any other, gets a water. Unless it's rained hard, proper rain, then it gets watered twice a day. And if it's hot, dry weather, then it will be 3 times a day. I keep it out of the sunniest spots as well. Okay, so here we are, halfway through the process. So this side of the tree, all the branches have been flexed and now they're vertical. This side of the tree, obviously, is just as it was when the plasticine came off. But if you look for a moment at the tree by the side, now that one had no weights on at all this summer, and you can see the difference between that and the plasticine. So that's what the plasticine has achieved, and then the little extra bit of tweaking finishes the job and gets those shoots vertical, which I think you can see is a far nicer, more pleasing image for the eye than this side of the tree. And what happens, what we're doing when we're flexing them, is we're actually sort of breaking the fibres inside the shoot a little bit. It's very difficult to actually snap a shoot. You can bend a bit of willow in all directions without snapping it, but when you really put my fingernail behind there and flex the twig over my nail, so I'm actually almost, you know, if it was a bit of maple, that would snap it, but because it's a bit of willow, it doesn't. What it does do is it breaks a few of the fibres and they kind of jam against one another, and then it won't move back. The other thing that I should mention is you don't just have to work with these new shoots. Some of the older shoots will actually have sprung up during the summer. So if I just flex something on the other side here so you can see. So even quite a large branch, still quite forgiving. And you should be able to see this move down. And then it's that much easier to get those shoots on the end vertical if the branch is above it. They're in the right position. Okay, so here we are. The tree's as finished as it's going to be for this year, and I've put a little display together so you get some idea of how it might look in a formal setting, I guess. So over 40 years this it's changed quite a few times. It's had quite a few restylings because it's really a very vigorous tree, and as time goes on and branches thicken and bends tend to straighten and grow out, problems arise, flaws develop, even though the tree might be finished as much as a tree is at one point. As time goes on, issues arise, and at the moment I'm going to point out the one that particularly bothers me. So I put a nice curve in the trunk there, made this branch into the apex, cut off the old trunk which was over here, and started developing a branch on this corner here. Now when that branch was small it was fine. Now that branch represents or carries 50% of the foliage of the tree, so it's become a sort of essential part of the tree really, and yet it sort of creates this kind of horizontal line which leads your eye into this branch instead of up into the apex. So at some point in the future that whole branch has really got to go, and now I've been steadily developing the apex to the point where I can cut that off and replace it with a part of the apex, and you can see that that's still a few years off, I'd say. Having said this tree is really vigorous, this actually took quite a few years to make up its mind that it was okay being the apex. It really didn't grow very well for a while. So that's something that needs to be done. Also, here's something I learned the hard way, and you don't have to. This hollow here that I created years ago, that was the first hollow I created to make the trunk a bit more interesting. And then I had some nice tight curves you'll see from some of the old pics, one of the earlier incarnations, but one of the nicest curves, there was quite an arc there. As the trunk gets thicker, the sap, if you like, kind of takes the shortest route and starts to put new wood on the inside of bends, and they steadily straighten out. So I thought, I know what I'll do, I'll stop you doing that. I'll take the bark off the inside of this bend and join it to this hollow, which will mean the sap has to flow around the outside of the bend. It works, it does, but this hollow has the effect of flattening the trunk just a little in that plane. And at 90 degrees, this hollow has the effect of flattening the trunk in that plane. And so that's created a bit of an inverse taper, and I'm going to have to keep an eye on that. I'm hoping it'll grow out over time. I may not need to do anything to it, but it's there, I'm aware of it. It's a flaw that bothers me, I guess. And there's one more tiny issue that I'm actually in the process of dealing with. So up until last year, this side of the hollow actually came straight out towards you in this direction, and that created a kind of closed space within the tree rather than the open, sort of flared, tapered kind of space that's a bit friendlier, I think, on the eye. So what I did last winter was I removed the bark from the tip of that area, and you can see there's some new bark that's developed to the side, and then in a few weeks, the end of this winter, I'll actually hollow that piece out so that the shape of the hollow will actually be reflected on both sides instead of these two angles kind of clashing. It's a tiny detail, but that's what makes a good tree into a great tree. That's what really makes the difference. And no matter how good you are, this is a living, changing thing. As time goes on, problems are going to come up and you need to deal with them. It's never finished, it's always in progress. and you have to evolve with the tree. You have to see those problems, and if possible, you know, prevent them before they get to this point, really. Unfortunately, my plan went astray.